James took another sip of his expensive whiskey, lunging in the upscale Manhattan bar where he and his wealthy friends often gathered. The warm lighting and soft jazz music set the perfect backdrop for their usual evening of showing off and one-upmanship. His business rival, Robert, sat across from him, a smug smile playing on his face. "Face it, James, you've never had a real relationship in your life. It's all just games to you," Robert said, swirling his drink. The other men at the table chuckled, knowing James's reputation as a notorious playboy. James raised an eyebrow. "I could get any woman to fall in love with me if I wanted to. I just prefer keeping things casual." "Really?" Robert leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with mischief. "Can to put your money where your mouth is, say $1 million. The table went quiet. Even for their wealthy circle, $1 million was serious money. James felt his competitive spirit rising. "What exactly did you have in mind?" Robert gestured around the bar. "The next woman who walks through that door, you have to marry her within 6 months, and stay married for at least a year." "Any woman?" James scoffed. "That's it." "Oh, but here's the catch. You can't tell her about the bet. She has to fall for you genuinely." Robert extended his hand. "So, do we have a deal?" James glanced at their audience, knowing he'd lose face if he backed down now. He grasped Robert's hand firmly. "Deal." For the next 15 minutes, they all watched the door intently. Finally, it swung open, and in walked May. A young woman in light blue scrubs, her long black hair tied back in a messy ponytail. She looked exhausted but carried herself with quiet dignity. "Well, there's your future wife," Robert smirked. "Unless you're having second thoughts." James straightened his designer jacket and stood up. "Watch and learn." He made his way to the bar where May was ordering a drink. "Rough day?" he asked, sliding onto the stool next to her. She glanced at him, then back at her phone. "You could say that." "Let me guess. You're a doctor." "Nurse," she corrected, a hint of pride in her voice. "Just finished a 12-hour shift at City General." James signaled the bartender. "Her drink's on me. And get her something to eat too. You must be starving." May started to protest, but James held up his hand. "I insist. Anyone who spends their day helping others deserves at least a decent meal." Something in his voice must have convinced her, because she relaxed slightly. "Thanks. I'm May." "James, it's a pleasure to meet you." As they talked, James was surprised to find himself genuinely interested in her stories about the hospital. She spoke about her patients with such warmth and compassion, especially the children in the cancer ward. He found himself sharing more real things about himself than he usually did with women, his childhood dreams, his relationship with his parents, even his fears about the future. Hours passed, and when May finally checked her watch, she looked startled. "Oh wow, I need to go. I have another shift tomorrow." "Can I get your number?" James asked, and for the first time in years, he felt slightly nervous about the answer. May hesitated, then smiled. "Okay, but just so you know, I'm not looking for anything casual." "Neither am I," James replied, and was shocked to realize that in that moment he meant it. Back at his table, his friends were impressed. "Smooth," Robert admitted. "But getting her number is the easy part. Let's see you close this deal." James glanced down at May's number in his phone, feeling an unfamiliar twinge of guilt. It was just a bet, he told himself. And yet, something about tonight felt different. As he watched May leave the bar, he couldn't shake the feeling that he might be getting into something much more complicated than he'd bargained for. What he didn't know yet was that this bet would change not just his life, but his entire way of seeing the world. And May, with her genuine heart and unwavering integrity, would teach him lessons no amount of money could buy. Little did James realize that his perfectly planned game was about to turn into something real, something that would make him question everything he thought he knew about love, life, and what truly matters in this world. To be continued. Over the next few weeks, James threw himself into winning May's heart with the same determination he usually reserved for business deals. But something unexpected happened. The more time he spent with her, the more he found himself genuinely looking forward to their moments together. Their first real date was nothing like his usual fancy restaurant routine. May had just finished her shift, and they grabbed hot dogs from a street vendor. They walked through Central Park, talking and laughing as the sun set. James found himself fascinated by how she saw the world, the way she noticed and cared about little things he'd always overlooked. "See that old man on the bench?" she pointed out. "He comes to the hospital every Tuesday to play guitar for the kids in pediatrics. Those small acts of kindness, they'd make all the difference." As days turned into weeks, James learned more about Mae's life. She'd grown up in a small apartment above her parents' restaurant, watching them work 16-hour days to give her a better future. When her father got sick, they lost everything to medical bills. That's what inspired her to become a nurse. She wanted to help families going through similar struggles. James had never met anyone like her. While he'd spent his life chasing money and status, she measured success by how many people she could help. It made him increasingly uncomfortable about the bet, but he kept telling himself it was too late to back out now. One evening, he picked her up from work, planning to take her to dinner. Instead, he found her in tears. "What's wrong?" he asked, genuinely concerned. "One of my young patients," she wiped her eyes. "His family can't afford the treatment he needs. Insurance won't cover it, and they're already working 3 jobs between them." Without thinking, James pulled out his checkbook. "How much do they need?" Mae stared at him in shock. "James, it's over $50,000. I can't let you." "Yes, you can," he said firmly, writing the check. "Consider it an investment in someone's future." The way she looked at him then, with such gratitude and admiration, made his stomach twist with guilt. Here she was, seeing the best in him, while he was still carrying out this bet. As their relationship deepened, James found himself doing things he'd never done before. He started volunteering at hospital fundraisers. He visited her young patients, bringing them toys and spending time reading to them. Each day, the $1 million bet felt more and more hollow compared to the warmth of Mae's smile when she saw him doing something kind. 3 months into their relationship, during a quiet dinner at her small apartment, James realized he was falling in love with her. The thought terrified him. This wasn't part of the plan. "What's on your mind?" Mae asked, noticing his distraction. "You seem far away tonight." James looked at her, really looked at her. She was beautiful, but not in the polished way he usually went for. Her beauty came from something deeper, from her kindness, her strength, her unwavering dedication to helping others. "Me," he said suddenly, his heart racing. "Will you marry me?" The words were out before he could stop them. Yes, they were the words he'd planned to say eventually to win the bet. But for the first time, he meant them with his whole heart. Mae's eyes widened. "James, we've only known each other for 3 months." "I know it seems fast," he said, taking her hands in his. "But I've never been more sure of anything in my life." The irony of speaking such truth while still hiding the bet's existence wasn't lost on him. Mae was quiet for a long moment. "My mom always said when something feels right, you know it in your heart." She squeezed his hands and smiled. "Yes, I'll marry you." That night, after Mae had fallen asleep, James stood by her window, looking out at the city lights. He should have been celebrating. He was on track to win the bet. Instead, he felt like the worst person in the world. Because somewhere along the way, this had stopped being about the money. He'd fallen in love with Mae, truly and deeply. But he built that love on a foundation of lies. As he watched her sleeping peacefully, James made a decision. He had to tell her the truth, even if it meant losing her. She deserved to know. But before he could gather his courage, his phone buzzed with a text from Robert. Tick-tock. 3 months left to seal the deal. $1 million is waiting. James turned off his phone and slipped back into bed, pulling Mae close. Tomorrow, he told himself. He'd tell her tomorrow. But deep down, he knew each day he delayed was another betrayal of the trust of the woman he'd grown to love. To be continued. The wedding was a lavish affair, just as James had always imagined his wedding would be. But standing at the altar, watching Mae walk down the aisle in her simple but elegant dress, none of the expensive decorations or high society guests mattered. All he could see was her radiant smile, and all he could feel was the crushing weight of his guilt. Their first few weeks of married life were a strange mix of genuine joy and hidden torment. They moved into James's penthouse apartment, which Mae immediately started making more homely. She brought in plants, family photos, and little treasures from thrift stores. The space that had once felt like a glossy magazine spread began to feel like a real home. "You don't mind all these changes, do you?" May asked one evening as she hung a handmade dream catcher in their bedroom. I know it's very different from your usual style. James pulled her close and kissed her forehead. I love it. I love how you make everything warm up more real. The words were honest, even if his past wasn't. Their daily routines fell into a comfortable rhythm. May continued her nursing shifts, refusing to quit even though James could easily support them both. My patients need me, she'd say simply. James found himself adjusting his work schedule to match hers better, something he'd never done for anyone before. One morning, he surprised himself by waking up early to make her breakfast before her shift. The look of delight on her face when she saw the slightly burnt toast and messy omelette made his heart swell. These small moments of genuine connection made the bet seem increasingly distant and meaningless. But reality had a way of crashing back in. Robert kept sending texts, counting down to when he'd have to pay up. Getting domestic, aren't we? He'd joke at business meetings. Who would have thought the great James Collins would end up making breakfast for a nurse? The worst part was, James couldn't even be properly angry at Robert's taunts anymore. Because May had changed him. He found himself caring less about status and more about substance. He started redirecting company profits into community projects. He set up a foundation to help families with medical bills, inspired by May's stories from the hospital. One evening, he came home to find May crying over a letter. "What's wrong?" he asked, immediately concerned. She showed him the letter. It was from a patient's family, thanking her for arranging financial help through his foundation. "You're doing so much good," she said, wiping her eyes. "I'm so proud to be your wife." Those words felt like a physical blow. Here she was, proud of him for something that had only happened because of her influence, while he was still carrying this terrible secret. The guilt started affecting him physically. He couldn't sleep well, lost his appetite. May noticed, of course. She noticed everything. "You're working too hard," she'd say, massaging his tense shoulders. "Maybe we should take a vacation." But it wasn't work stressing him out. It was living with the knowledge that their entire marriage, this beautiful, real thing that had grown between them, had sprouted from seeds of deception. One night, after a particularly difficult day at the hospital, May curled up against him on their couch. "You know what I love most about you?" she asked sleepily. "Your heart. How you pretend to be all business-focused, but really you care so deeply about helping others." James felt his eyes burn with unshed tears. Because the truth was, he'd only learned to care because of her. She had transformed him from someone who saw people as pieces in a game into someone who genuinely wanted to make a difference. The monthly dinner with Robert and their other wealthy friends was approaching, the dinner where James would officially win the bet. But as he watched Mai sleeping peacefully beside him, a hand resting over his heart, he knew he couldn't go through with it. The money meant nothing compared to what he stood to lose. He had to tell her the truth, but every time he tried, he saw her trusting eyes, her loving smile, and the words died in his throat. How do you tell someone that your entire relationship began as a cruel game? How do you explain that even though the love is real now, it was built on a foundation of lies? What James didn't know was that the truth had a way of coming out, whether you were ready for it or not. And sometimes, the things we try hardest to hide are the very things that end up exposed in the most painful ways. To be continued, the truth came crashing down on a quiet Sunday afternoon. Mai had forgotten some paperwork at home and returned early from her shift. As she walked into their penthouse, she heard James's voice coming from his home office. He was on the phone, and something in his tone made her pause outside the door. "Yes, Robert, I know the bet's almost up," James was saying. "The $1 million is yours to transfer whenever you want. I married her, didn't I? I played the game perfectly." May's world stopped spinning. She pressed her hand against the wall to steady herself, her heart pounding so loud she could barely hear the rest of the conversation. "Look, I don't want to discuss this anymore," James continued, sounding irritated. "Yes, I know it started as a bet to marry the next woman who walked into the bar that night, but things are different now." The sound of May's files hitting the floor cut him off. James spun around to find her standing in the doorway, her face drained of color. "May," he whispered, the phone slipping from his hand. She just stared at him, tears streaming down her face. All the little things that hadn't quite made sense suddenly clicked into place: his rush to marriage, his sudden interest in her charity work, the weird comments from his friends. How much? Her voice was barely audible. May, please let me explain. How much? She demanded, her hands shaking. $1 million, he admitted, taking a step toward her. But May, you have to understand. She held up her hand, stopping him in his tracks. All this time, our whole relationship, our marriage, it was just a bet. No. I mean, yes, it started that way, but it became real. What I feel for you is real. Real? She laughed, but it was a hollow sound that made him flinch. Was it real when you first talked to me at the bar? Was it real when you proposed? Was any of it real, James? He tried to reach for her, but she backed away. Everything changed. You changed me, May. I fell in love with you. Don't. The word cut through the air like a knife. Don't you dare say you love me. People who love each other don't treat them like a game piece. They don't bet on their feelings. She turned and walked out of the office. James followed her to their bedroom, where she was already pulling out a suitcase. What are you doing? Please, just let me explain everything. Explain what? She threw clothes into the suitcase without even looking at them. How you and your rich friends had a good laugh about the poor nurse who fell for your act. How you probably celebrated every milestone of our relationship as another step closer to winning your bet. It wasn't like that. Robert challenged me, said I couldn't commit to anyone. I was stupid and arrogant and took the bet, but meeting you changed everything. You made me see what really matters in life. May stopped packing and looked at him, really looked at him. You know what's funny? I actually believe you. I believe you grew to care about me. But that makes it worse, James, because you watched me fall in love with you, watched me trust you completely, and every single day you chose to keep lying. She zipped up the suitcase. I gave you so many chances to be honest. All those times I asked why you were stressed, why you seemed distant, you could have told me the truth. I was afraid of losing you, he admitted, his voice breaking. Well, congratulations, now you have. She picked up her suitcase and walked to the door. I hope the $1 million was worth it. May, please. Where are you going? We can work this out. She turned back one last time, her eyes filled with a pain that would haunt him for months to come. You know what hurts the most? Not the bet itself, but that you made me question every genuine moment we shared. You took something beautiful and pure and turned it into a lie. With that, she walked out of their home, out of his life, leaving nothing but a deafening silence and the faint scent of her perfume in the air. James stood in their empty apartment, surrounded by all the little touches May had added to make it a home, the plants she'd carefully tended, the family photos, the silly magnets on the fridge. Each item was a reminder of the real love he'd gained and lost because of his own foolishness. His phone buzzed. Another message from Robert about transferring the money. James picked up the phone and threw it against the wall, watching it shatter into pieces just like his life had moments ago. He had won the bet, but lost everything that really mattered. And as he sank to the floor, surrounded by the remnants of their life together, he realized some mistakes can't be fixed with all the money in the world. To be continued. The days following May's departure felt like walking through a thick fog. James couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on work. He kept hoping she would call, that she would let him explain, but her silence was deafening. The money from the bet sat untouched in his account. He couldn't bear to look at it. One morning, desperate to feel close to her somehow, he went to the hospital where she worked. But when he reached her floor, a different nurse was at the station. May. The head nurse shook her head. She took an indefinite leave of absence, said something about needing time to figure things out. James wandered the hospital halls, remembering all the times he'd visited her here. That's when he noticed something. Everywhere he looked, there were traces of May's kindness. The reading corner in pediatrics she'd set up, the hand-painted murals in the children's ward, the volunteer program she'd organized. He started asking questions, talking to other nurses, to patients' families. Each conversation revealed another layer of May's life he'd never known about. She'd been using most of her salary to help patients who couldn't afford their medications. She'd spent weekends organizing fundraisers for families struggling with medical bills. She'd even been taking night classes in hospital administration, dreaming of making bigger changes in healthcare. She never told you. An elderly volunteer looked surprised. That's me for you. Always doing good things quietly, never wanting recognition. The revelation hit James hard. While he'd been focused on his bet, treating their relationship like a game, May had been quietly changing lives. She'd never bragged about it, never used it to make herself look good. She just did what needed to be done. Determined to understand more, James started digging deeper into May's past. He hired a private investigator not to track her down, but to learn about her life before they met. What he discovered humbled him completely. May had grown up in a struggling immigrant family. Her parents had owned a small restaurant, working endless hours to make ends meet. When her father got sick, they lost everything to medical bills. Instead of becoming bitter, May had turned her family's tragedy into motivation to help others. She'd worked 3 jobs to put herself through nursing school. Even then, she'd volunteered at homeless shelters, tutored underprivileged kids, and helped elderly neighbors with their groceries. The investigator found dozens of thank you letters from people whose lives she'd touched. "Sir," the investigator said, "I've done this job for 20 years, but I've never seen someone with such a consistent pattern of helping others. No fanfare, no social media posts, just quiet, constant kindness." James sat in his empty penthouse, surrounded by the investigator's reports, feeling smaller by the minute. He'd thought he was the one doing May a favor by marrying her, bringing her into his wealthy world. In reality, she'd been the wealthy one all along, rich in the things that truly mattered. He thought about all the times she tried to show him this different way of measuring success. The joy in a child's face when they got better. The relief in a parent's eyes when they learned their medical bills would be covered. The simple satisfaction of knowing you'd made someone's day a little better. One report caught his eye. It was about a small children's hospital in her hometown. It was struggling financially, at risk of closing down. May had been sending them money every month, even though she could barely afford it. The hospital served mainly low-income families, providing care regardless of their ability to pay. For the first time since she left, James felt a spark of purpose. He couldn't undo his mistake, couldn't take back the bet or the lies. But maybe he could honor what May had taught him about true wealth and genuine caring. He called his financial advisor. "I want to set up a foundation," he said, "and I need you to find out everything you can about a children's hospital that's about to close down." As he put the phone down, James looked at their wedding photo still sitting on his desk. "I'm so sorry," he whispered to May's smiling face. "I didn't understand then, but I'm starting to now." What he didn't know was that his journey to understand May's world was just beginning, and that sometimes the path to redemption starts with finally seeing the truth about yourself. To be continued, the transformation of James Collins took everyone by surprise. The man who once measured success in dollars and deals was now throwing himself into charitable work with the same intensity he'd once reserved for making money. His first project was saving the children's hospital May had been supporting. Instead of just writing a check, he went there himself, spent time understanding their needs. He sat with the doctors, talked to the families, played with the kids in the cancer ward. "Mr. Collins," the hospital director said one day, "I don't understand. Why are you doing all this?" James watched a young girl in a wheelchair reading to her little brother. "Let's just say someone taught me what really matters in life." He didn't just save the hospital, he transformed it. New equipment, expanded facilities, a program to help families with housing during long-term treatments. But he did it all quietly, without press releases or publicity events, just like May would have done. His business friends noticed the change too. At their regular dinners, instead of bragging about deals and acquisitions, James talked about the families he'd met, the lives being changed. "What happened to you?" Robert asked one evening, genuinely puzzled. "This isn't the James Collins I know." James looked at his old friend. Maybe that James Collins needed to disappear. He stopped going to fancy clubs, started spending time in community centers and soup kitchens instead. He learned to listen to people's stories, to see beyond surface problems to the root causes. His business skills came in handy. He could spot inefficiencies, streamline processes, make donations go further. One day, while helping at a free medical clinic, an elderly volunteer patted his hand. "You remind me of another kind soul who used to help here, a nurse named May." James's heart skipped a beat. "You knew May?" "Oh yes," the woman smiled. "She was here every weekend before she moved to the city. Always the first to arrive, last to leave. said she was just paying forward the kindness others had shown her family. These little glimpses of May's past life kept appearing, like pieces of a puzzle James was finally putting together. Each story showed him more of the woman he'd married, but never truly understood until it was too late. He turned his company's focus toward healthcare initiatives. The $1 million from the bet, he used it to start a scholarship fund for nursing students from underprivileged backgrounds. He named it after May's father, though he kept his own name out of it. His old circle of friends dwindled as he spent more time in hospitals and community centers. But he found new friends. Doctors passionate about their work, nurses who stayed extra hours to comfort scared patients, volunteers who gave their time freely to help others. One rainy evening, as he was leaving the children's hospital, he ran into Robert. "I've been watching you," Robert said. "All these changes, all this charity work. It's because of her, isn't it?" James looked out at the rain. "I made a bet to marry someone, Robert, but I ended up meeting the person who would show me everything wrong with the man I was." "Have you heard from her?" "No," James sighed, "and I probably never will, but that's not why I'm doing this. I'm doing it because she taught me what real wealth looks like. It's not in our bank accounts, it's in how many lives we touch, how many people we help." As he drove home that night, James thought about how far he'd come. The old James would have seen his current life as a step down, spending time with sick kids instead of making deals, working with community organizations instead of corporate boards. But now he understood what May had known all along, that true fulfillment comes from giving, not taking. That real power isn't about control, but about making a positive difference in others' lives. In his penthouse, now converted into a meeting space for healthcare charities, James looked at the dream catcher May had hung, the only piece of their life together he hadn't packed away. He'd finally learned the lessons she tried to teach him. He just wished he'd learned them before losing her. What he didn't know was that his journey of transformation was being noticed by more people than he realized, and that sometimes the biggest changes come just when we think our story is over. To be continued. 6 months after May's departure, James found himself in a small rural town, helping set up a medical clinic. He'd heard about a community struggling without proper healthcare and had brought a team of doctors and supplies. The work kept him busy, kept him focused, kept him from dwelling too much on what he'd lost. One morning, as he was unloading medical supplies from his truck, he heard a familiar voice that made his heart stop. "We need those vaccines in the refrigerator right away." He turned slowly, hardly daring to believe it. There stood May, clipboard in hand, giving instructions to volunteers. She looked different. Her hair was shorter, and she seemed thinner, but her eyes still held that same determination he remembered. She hadn't seen him yet. James stood frozen, watching her work. She moved with purpose, organizing supplies, checking on patients, offering kind words to worried mothers. This was her element, helping others, making a difference. Finally, she turned and saw him. The clipboard slipped from her hands. For a long moment, they just stared at each other. Then May spoke, her voice careful, controlled. "What are you doing here?" "Helping," he said simply, "just like you taught me." She picked up her clipboard, her hands slightly shaking. "I've heard about what you've been doing. The children's hospital, the scholarship fund, the medical clinics." "I had a good teacher." May looked at him properly then, studying his face. He knew what she saw. The designer suits replaced by practical work clothes, the manicured hands now calloused from manual labor, the eyes that had lost their arrogant gleam and gained something deeper. "Walk with me," he asked softly. They walked in silence to a small park nearby. Children played on worn equipment while parents watched from benches. "I'm not here to ask for forgiveness," James began. "I don't deserve it. But I want you to know that losing you made me finally see myself clearly. I didn't like what I saw." "So you changed," May said, watching the children play. "I tried to become the kind of person you believed I was, the kind of person you deserved." She turned to him. "Did you do it for me? To win me back?" "No," he answered honestly. "I did it because you showed me what really matters in life. Even if you never spoke to me again, I couldn't go back to being that person who made that bet." May was quiet for a long time. "I saw what you did with the bet money, the nursing scholarship fund, named after my father. He raised an amazing daughter. It seemed right." A small smile touched her lips. The old James wouldn't have done that. He would have kept the money, bragged about winning. The old James was a fool. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sunset paint the sky in soft colors. "I can't just forget what happened," May finally said. "I'm not asking you to." But, she continued, maybe we could start over, not as husband and wife, but as two people who care about helping others. This clinic needs all the help it can get. James felt hope flutter in his chest for the first time in months. "I'd like that." "No lies this time," she said firmly. "No games, just honest work helping people who need it." "I promise." As they walked back to the clinic, James realized that sometimes you have to lose everything to find what you were really looking for. His journey had started with a cruel bet, but it had led him to something far more valuable than money, a purpose, a chance to make a real difference, and maybe, just maybe, a second chance with the woman who had changed his life. He didn't know if May would ever fully trust him again, if they would ever recapture what they had lost. But he did know that whatever happened, he would spend the rest of his life trying to be worthy of the lessons she had taught him. As they reached the clinic, a mother rushed out with a sick child. Without hesitation, both James and May moved to help. In that moment, working side by side to help someone in need, they shared a look of understanding. Sometimes, love stories don't end with grand gestures or dramatic reconciliations. Sometimes, they begin again in quiet moments of shared purpose and redemption. The end.